The trauma shears hung from her scrubs like a question no one had asked yet. Rachel Torres clipped them into place, left hip, muscle memory older than her nursing license, and the engraved call sign caught the fluorescent light for exactly half a second before she turned toward the corridor. Whisper. That's what the handle read, worn smooth from hands that had held other people's lives together in places most people would never see on a map. The shears were from another life. Another name. Another version of her that wore different uniforms and answered to different chains of command. She'd kept them anyway. Some habits die harder than others. Valley Memorial hummed with the particular silence of a hospital at 2 in the morning. Fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical prayer above linoleum that smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and something else underneath, the smell of every person who had walked through here terrified or broken or both. Rachel had been a temp nurse for exactly 3 days. 3 days was enough to learn where the supply cabinet stuck on the third drawer, enough to memorize the code for the medication dispensary, and enough to understand that nobody here cared much about a contract worker whose name they wouldn't remember by Friday. That suited her fine. She'd learned long ago that invisibility was a form of power. She was restocking the supply cabinet on the 3rd floor when she heard the elevator doors open at 2:13 a.m. Not unusual. Hospitals don't sleep. What was unusual was the sound underneath the doors opening, the specific rhythm of people trying to move quietly. Trying and failing. She recognized the footsteps immediately. Dr. Thornton. She'd seen him twice since arriving. Once during the initial assignment briefing, where he'd looked through her like she was furniture, and once in the hallway when she'd dropped a tray of empty medication cups. He hadn't stopped. Just stepped over the scattered plastic like it was debris. Now there were other footsteps with his. 2 sets. Administrative, from the sound of them, one in expensive shoes that clicked against the tile with the confidence of someone who never had to move quietly, the other in the flat rubber soles of someone accustomed to walking institutional corridors. Rachel didn't move. She had excellent hearing. It was a skill she'd developed over 23 years, back when hearing saved lives. Back when hearing could mean the difference between an ambush and going home. The footsteps stopped near the supply area. There was a low conversation she couldn't quite make out, then the sound of metal wheels, a gurney rolling slow and deliberate. No alarm beeping. No for pump hum. Just the whisper of rubber on tile and the squeak of wheels that needed lubricant. Rachel's hand went to the shears without her decision to touch them. Muscle memory. Pure autonomic response. The same reflex that had saved 3 lives in Sanjin Valley and would end her career if she ever let anyone know she still had it. She moved toward the elevator without letting herself think about it. That was the thing about training. When you were trained well enough, your body made the decisions before your mind could catch up. She caught sight of them just as they reached the service elevator. Dr. Thornton and 2 people she recognized as administrators from the East Wing. And between them, on the gurney, a sedated patient. No chart clipped to the bed rail. No escort protocol log. No documentation of any kind. Just a man who'd been chemically put to sleep and was being transported by 3 people in business casual to a location that definitely wasn't part of any standard floor rotation. The elevator doors opened. The gurney rolled inside. Rachel watched the numbers above the doorway start their descent. Sub-level parking. She knew the hospital layout well enough now to understand what that meant. They weren't moving him to another floor. They weren't moving him to another unit or a specialist's office or anywhere that appeared on the official census. She stood alone in the corridor for exactly 7 seconds. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical hum. Down the hallway, a heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm from room for 21, alive, stable, monitored. Behind her, the supply cabinet stood half restocked with sterile gauge packs and saline flushes and all the small implements of keeping people alive inside a system that was supposed to protect them. She was 3 days into this assignment. 3 days was not enough time to build a reputation. 3 days was not enough time to accuse anyone of anything. 3 days was also not a lot of time to destroy a career by asking questions. She moved toward the service elevator. The pain in her left leg was sharp and specific, shrapnel from an IED in Loga province, 17 years ago, the kind of injury that had a medical classification and a percentage rating and a pension she'd never cashed. The limp was barely noticeable anymore unless she was tired or moving fast. She was moving fast now. Her hand went to the shears again. Not because she was planning to use them. Just because some objects become anchors when the rest of your life is uncertain. The elevator was empty when she stepped inside. She pressed the sub-level button. The doors closed. The descent made her ears pop, the air pressure change, the kind of thing most people's brains filtered out automatically. Rachel's brain didn't filter out much anymore. The shrapnel had changed something in her neural wiring, some doctor had explained once, made her hyper-aware of environmental details other people missed. Pressure changes. Temperature shifts. The specific cadence of someone's breathing when they were lying. The exact moment in a room when the social contract failed and survival instinct kicked in. The sub-level doors opened to a parking garage. Single row of fluorescent lights running down the center. The smell of engine oil and concrete and something else, the particular dampness of below-ground spaces. She heard the voices before she saw them. Low. Urgent. The sound of money moving somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Rachel stayed near the elevator bank, in the shadow where the light didn't quite reach. She could see them now. The gurney was positioned near a black SUV, the kind with tinted windows and no hospital insignia. Dr. Thornton was standing with his hand on the patient's shoulder. The two administrators were opening the vehicle's rear doors. This was the moment. The moment where a temp nurse made a choice. The moment where she could turn around and go back upstairs and file an incident report that would get filed in a drawer somewhere and never mentioned again. She could protect herself. Hospitals were good at protecting themselves. They moved their problems to sublevels and tinted windows, and they made sure nobody asked questions because questions cost money and money was something that always won in systems designed to distribute it toward people like Dr. Thornton. She stepped out of the shadows. "I need to see that patient's transport documentation," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd trained it that way over decades. She'd trained her entire body that way. To move like someone who'd never been afraid. And the discharge authorization. The voices stopped. The fluorescent lights continued their hum. Dr. Thornton turned. His jaw tightened when he saw her. Not because he recognized her as a threat, she was a temp nurse, a shadow in scrubs, invisible. He tightened because he'd been interrupted. Because his plan, whatever it was, had suddenly developed a witness. "This is a secured transport," he said. His voice had the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Authorized personnel only." "Then you'll have documentation," Rachel said. "I'm authorized personnel. All transport requires a chart and a discharge order. This patient appears to have neither." One of the administrators moved toward her. He was large. The kind of large that was usually enough to discourage questions. Rachel didn't move. She'd learned long ago that presence wasn't about size. Presence was about the quality of the silence a person could generate. The kind of silence that made the air pressure change around them. The kind of silence that made other people feel like they were drowning. "You're a temp," the administrator said. "You don't have clearance for this conversation." "Then I'll escalate it," Rachel said. "To administration. To the compliance officer. To the Pennsylvania Department of Health if necessary. Your choice. You can show me the documentation right now, or I can make this much more complicated." The second administrator was already moving toward the elevator. Running. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the parking garage like a confession. Dr. Thornton's hand was still on the sedated patient's shoulder. The SUV doors were open. Nobody moved for the space of 3 seconds. "You're making a serious mistake," Dr. Thornton said. His voice was different now. Harder. The kind of hard that came from someone who'd suddenly realized his power over this situation might not be absolute. You have no idea who you're interfering with. Rachel clipped her shears. The mechanical snap of the gesture was louder in the parking garage than it should have been. She met his eyes. Show me the documentation, or I'm making phone calls. She didn't know yet what this meant. She didn't know about the smuggling operation or the medical kidnapping ring or the reason a sedated patient needed to be moved in the middle of the night by 3 people with no paperwork. She didn't know that this moment would be the first domino in a cascade that would eventually bring a brigadier general into a parking lot in Philadelphia and force her to choose between her career and her conscience and discover that she'd already made that choice 20 years ago when she'd pulled a terrified boy from a burning Humvee in a valley that the Pentagon had officially claimed never happened. But standing there in the fluorescent light, her hand on the shears with her call sign worn into the metal, Rachel Torres understood something essential. Some things were worth more than a job. Some things were worth more than invisibility. The second administrator appeared again at the top of the stairwell. Behind him came 2 security officers. Dr. Thornton's expression shifted. Not fear. Not yet. But the specific recalibration of someone who'd suddenly understood that the narrative was no longer entirely under his control. Stand down, he told the security officers. Then, to Rachel, we're done here. He turned back to the SUV. The administrators helped him load the gurney. The black vehicle pulled out of the sublevel parking with its tinted windows intact and its papers unsigned and its cargo that everyone knew and no one would acknowledge. Rachel stood alone under the fluorescent lights. The shears hung from her scrubs. The call sign caught the light again. Whisper. She'd been a lot of things before she was a nurse. She'd been a soldier. A medic. A person who made decisions in seconds that saved lives. A person who understood that the quiet ones, the ones nobody noticed, the ones with worn shears and hidden call signs, were usually the ones holding everything together. She turned toward the elevator. The clock on the wall read 2:41 a.m. She had 4 hours before morning rounds. For hours before Dr. Thornton would see her at the nurse's station and understand that she'd followed him. That she'd seen something. That she'd asked questions. For hours before everything changed. The overhead page crackled at 9:48 a.m. Rachel the Band-Aid to administration. Rachel the Band-Aid. Nurses on the 3rd floor turned toward each other, smirks spreading like infection. An orderly pushed a gurney with exaggerated slowness, waiting for the moment she passed so he could snicker loud enough for her to hear. Rachel walked through the corridor without breaking stride, her trauma shears visible on her hip, the engraved call sign catching fluorescent light. No reaction crossed her face. The nickname hung in the air like antiseptic fumes, derogatory shorthand for temporary nurses who believed they belonged in a real hospital, who thought 3 days qualified them for anything beyond supply runs and bedpan emptying. The administrator's office smelled like leather furniture and expensive cologne. Dr. Thornton stood beside the director, his posture suggesting he'd been waiting with practiced impatience. He wore his white coat unbuttoned, a deliberate casualness that conveyed authority without effort. Temps who wander restricted areas create liability exposures, he began, his voice smooth as a scalpel. You were observed in unauthorized zones at 2:19 a.m. Basement corridor. No legitimate reason to be there. Rachel held his gaze steady. 5 seconds stretched between them like a held breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She let the silence do its work, watching his jaw tighten, watching him calculate whether to speak or wait. Finally, she said, I was restocking supplies as assigned. Night shift inventory protocol requires basement rotation. Her voice came out measured, clinical. Perhaps you'd like to explain why patient transport protocols were bypassed. Or why sedated patients move through restricted corridors without escort documentation. His face flushed red, a deepening crimson that started at his collar and crept upward. The director shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in the papers on his desk. That's an operational matter, Thornton said, but the words came faster now, defensive. Not your concern, Ms. Torres. Patient safety is everyone's concern, Rachel replied. She stood. If there's nothing else, I have a shift starting. The director cleared his throat. "We'll be monitoring your floor assignments more carefully going forward. You're dismissed." She walked out before he could say anything else. The supply closet at 1:15 p.m. was narrow, lined with boxes of gauze and saline, the air thick with the chemical bite of sterilizing solution. Rachel reached for a case of bandages when the door swung inward and Dr. Thornton blocked her exit. His presence filled the small space like pressure building before a storm. His finger came up, jabbing toward her face, not quite touching, but close enough that she could see the wedding ring catching light, the manicured nails, the tremor of rage that made his hand shake slightly. "Temps who can't follow chain of command don't last here," he said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and intimate. "You think you're special because you worked some field hospital overseas? You're a nobody here. You're a temp. You're expendable. And if you keep asking questions, if you keep wondering where you don't belong, you won't last to the end of your contract." His breath smelled like coffee and cinnamon gum. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Rachel's eyes became something frozen, not angry, not afraid, but utterly devoid of reaction. She waited until he finished, let him see that his words had hit nothing, dissolved against whatever composure she carried like armor. Then she spoke in a voice so quiet the sound became a kind of weapon itself, a scalpel cutting through his fury with surgical precision. The last man who mistook silence for weakness ended up explaining himself to a congressional committee. She moved toward the door, her shoulder brushing his as she passed. He didn't move. The supply closet door swung shut behind her, and she heard him exhale, not quite a gasp, but close. She continued down the corridor without looking back, the trauma shears at her hip a small weight against her leg, the engraved callsign feeling suddenly heavier. The parking lot at 7:56 p.m. was concrete and sodium lights, the kind of place where shift changes happened like tidal movements, one crew flooding in as another receded. The entire night team gathered near the entrance for changeover briefing. Nurses clustered in 2s and 3s. Orderlies checked their phones. Security personnel leaned against their vehicle, watching the traffic beyond the lot. Dr. Thornton approached with a security supervisor in tow, moving like someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be second-guessed. He held a new badge, orange tier, a color that screamed restriction to anyone in hospital hierarchy. Yellow tier meant access to critical floors. Orange tier meant you stayed in recovery rooms and general wards, the low acuity zones where mistakes rarely killed people, where nothing important happened. Effective immediately, he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, you're restricted to non-critical floors. Patient safety protocols. You'll continue your shift assignments, but your badge access has been adjusted accordingly. He handed her the orange badge with the ceremony of someone distributing punishment, waiting for the moment when she'd accept it, when she'd acknowledge the downgrade, when her humiliation would register on her face. Rachel took the badge. She clipped it over her yellow one without a word, the orange covering most of the yellow, visible to everyone. She looked at Dr. Thornton once, her eye still frozen, still revealing nothing. Then she turned toward her car. The night crew watched her go. A nurse muttered, Band-Aid under her breath to her colleague. An orderly smirked. No one made eye contact with her as she walked past. The parking lot stretched before her, the row of vehicles reflecting the sodium lights in pale orange streaks. Her limp was more pronounced tonight, the weight of the orange badge somehow pressing down on her gait, making her favor her right side more than usual. The old wound in her left hip, the one from Kandahar, from a roadside explosion that killed 2 rangers and nearly killed her, flared with sharp pain as she walked. She reached her car, a nondescript Honda Civic that smelled of vinyl and old coffee. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine, her hands resting on the steering wheel, the engraved call sign on her trauma shears catching the parking lot light one more time. Swift, the letters read. That's what they'd called her in the 75th Ranger Regiment. That's what they'd called her before she became a temporary nurse in Philadelphia, before she'd walked into Valley Memorial looking for anonymity and found instead a face from 20 years ago. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 nights later, at 11:20 p.m., when the code alarm shrieked from the 4th floor, the critical wing she was now forbidden from entering. Rachel was on the second floor, restocking gauze in the supply station near the nurse's station, when she heard it. Not just the alarm itself, but the specific pattern, the urgent rhythm that meant active medical crisis, not a training drill, not a routine page. The fourth floor. The critical wing. Room for 47, if the hallway commotion was coming from where she thought it was. She took the stairwell despite the orange badge, climbing 2 flights with her limp becoming barely noticeable when adrenaline overrode the old pain. The fourth-floor hallway was chaos held in check by institutional protocol, organized panic, the way hospitals managed catastrophe. Through the window of room for 47, she could see the patient thrashing, his body convulsing against restraints, his oxygen saturation monitor displaying numbers that descended like a countdown to death: 88. 84, 79. 72. But the room was surrounded. Not filled, the room itself was locked, sealed, but 20 physicians crowded the hallway outside, all staring at the patient through the window, none entering. She counted them as she pushed forward: an attending cardiologist, 2 surgical residents, a pulmonologist, 3 critical care fellows, an anesthesiologist, nurses, orderlies, a hospitalist, a nephrologist, an infectious disease specialist, an emergency medicine physician, a trauma surgeon, a cardiac surgeon, 2 more residents, and 3 other attendings she didn't recognize. 20. All watching. All silent. "We need legal clearance for emergency airway intervention," one of them said. "Who signs off on this?" another asked. "His condition is pre-existing. We need waivers. Without waivers, we're liable." Liability exposure is significant here. One by one, they cited valid bureaucratic reasons. Insurance exposure. Malpractice concerns. Hospital protocol. Attending physician authorization. Patient consent documentation. Scope of practice questions. Each reason was technically accurate, each one precise, each one utterly useless to the man dying on the other side of the window. The monitor climbed down: 68. 64, 58. The patient's airway was collapsing. She could see the struggle from the hallway, the way his body fought for air that wouldn't come, the panic in his movements becoming increasingly desperate and then increasingly weak. Respiratory failure. Within minutes, cardiac arrest. Rachel pushed to the front of the crowd. A senior physician, the attending, turned toward her, recognition and dismissal crossing his face simultaneously. "You're not cleared for this floor." But she was already looking at the patient through the window, and the moment her eyes found his neck, everything collapsed into a single moment of recognition that erased 20 years like they'd never happened. Scars. Shrapnel scars on his neck, the exact shape and pattern she'd seen when she'd pulled a terrified local boy from a burning Humvee in Korengal Valley, Afghanistan, while mortars fell around them like rain. The scars she'd traced with her hands, trying to stop the bleeding, whispering in Pashto that he was going to be okay, that he was going to survive, that she wouldn't let him die. He'd survived that day. The shrapnel had damaged his auditory nerve, made him deaf in both ears, but he'd lived. She'd made sure of it. And now he was dying again. The attending physician said something else, words about protocol, about liability, about proper chain of command, but Rachel was already moving, already pushing past him, already reaching for the door handle with the kind of certainty that comes from having already made the decision before the moment arrived. The room went dead silent. 20 physicians stopped talking. The only sound was the ventilator wheeze, the monitor descending toward flat line, and the door swinging open as Rachel Torres stepped inside with her orange badge visible, her restricted status glaring, her trauma shears catching light as she reached for the emergency equipment and began the kind of surgery that no temporary nurse should know how to perform. The orange badge felt like a collar. 2 shifts on the non-critical floors, pediatrics, orthopedics, the slow wards where nothing required her hands to remember, and Rachel could taste the shift in air pressure around her. Conversation stopped when she passed the nurse's station. A resident she'd helped intubate on day 1 now asked for someone else. The whispers weren't subtle. "That's the temp who challenged Dr. Thornton." "Yeah, the one he demoted. Heard she broke protocol in the ER." The words were precise instruments, each one designed to isolate. She accepted the assignments without complaint, performed the work without fanfare, and moved through Valley Memorial like a ghost in scrubs, which was exactly what the hospital wanted. A temp was supposed to vanish, disappear, cause no ripples. But ghosts have long memories. On the afternoon of the third shift, the overhead intercom crackled alive with a code that made every trained person in the building go rigid. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. I repeat, Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Rachel's hand stilled over the vitals chart she'd been reviewing. Room for 47. She knew that room number the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. The deaf veteran. The boy from Korengal Valley, now a grown man with scars that ran deeper than skin, suddenly folded inside a catastrophe that a routine procedure was never supposed to trigger. She moved without deciding to move. The orange badge swung against her chest as she walked, a physical reminder of her restricted status, and she felt the weight of it like a bullet she was carrying toward someone else's war. The hallway to Trauma Bay 4 was already crowded. Doctors, residents, nurses who had legitimate access, legitimate authority, legitimate right to be there. The monitor inside the room was descending, a sound like a heartbeat counting backward toward nothing. The alarm shrieked in the frequency of panic, cutting through the antiseptic smell and the rubber glove friction and the electrical hum of machines fighting biology. Rachel stopped outside the doorway. She could see the patient on the table. Could see the chest heaving in patterns that weren't breathing so much as drowning on dry land. The anesthesiologist was shouting numbers. O2 sat dropping. 68% and falling. Airway is collapsed. Complete tracheal compromise. His voice carried the texture of a man watching mathematics turn into mortality. We need to re-intubate. Someone get me the senior airway surgeon. 20 doctors stood in that room. Rachel counted them without meaning to, a habit from another life, a skill learned in places where knowing the numbers of your team meant knowing if you lived or died. 20 physicians in white coats, in surgical caps, in the uniform of institutional authority and competitive credentials. 20 people with the power to intervene. 20 people who froze. We need legal clearance before we do anything invasive, the first one said. His nameplate read Dr. Hayes, Chief of Medicine. This patient has an unclear medical history. Possible autoimmune condition. If we perform an emergency procedure and something goes wrong. He's dying right now, the anesthesiologist snapped back. SAT's at 62. We have maybe 3 minutes. 3 minutes is enough time to call risk management, Hayes said. His voice had the smooth quality of someone protecting himself from something. We need a liability waiver. We need to document that this patient consented to emergency. He's deaf, someone called out. How do we get informed consent if he can't hear the procedure? Then we need an interpreter. We need documentation. There's no time for documentation. Then we have to wait for legal authorization. The room had become a machine designed to fail. Each objection was technically correct. Each protocol was institutionally defensible. Each person who spoke was protecting something that wasn't the patient. The alarm continued its descent. The oxygen saturation hit 58%. The monitors were starting to show the electrical chaos of a heart that was beginning to forget its rhythm. And then Dr. Thornton appeared at the far end of the hallway. He was moving with the precision of a man who had been alerted the moment the code was called. His face had the quality of someone who had already calculated the consequences and found them manageable. He pushed through the crowd with the authority of someone who owned the space, and when he reached the doorway of Trauma Bay 4, his eye swept across the room like a scanner, cataloging each person, each failure point, each possible vector for blame. Then his gaze landed on Rachel. She was still in the hallway. The orange badge was visible. Her restricted access level was glowing like a warning sign. And in that moment, Dr. Thornton's expression shifted, not to surprise, but to satisfaction. Like he had been waiting for exactly this moment. Like he had been waiting for her to violate another protocol. "Security," he called out without looking away from her. His voice was conversational. Almost pleasant. "Remove this nurse. She's in violation of her access restrictions. Orange badge personnel are not authorized in Trauma Bay 4. 2 security guards were already moving from the far side of the hallway. Rachel watched them come. She watched the doctor inside the room look back at the monitors and see the numbers falling. 45% oxygen saturation. 22 seconds until the brain damage became irreversible. 22 seconds until the deaf veteran from Korengal Valley, the boy she had pulled from a burning Humvee 20 years ago, became someone permanently absent from his own body. "If he dies," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the alarm like steel through water, "you're the ones who explain it to his family. Not me." She didn't wait for Dr. Thornton's response. She didn't wait for the security guards to grab her arms. She shoved through the doorway into Trauma Bay 4 with the kind of movement that came from a body that had spent decades understanding that authority was sometimes just permission you had to take for yourself. Inside the room, the chaos was crystalline. Every monitor was screaming. The anesthesiologist was ventilating manually, his jaw clenched with the knowledge that he was slowing the inevitable. The trachea had collapsed completely, the old shrapnel wound from Korengal Valley had never healed properly. Scar tissue had calcified around the airway, and something about the anesthesia or the positioning or the cruel mathematics of time had triggered a cascade that was now eating the patient from the inside. Rachel's hands moved before her mind caught up. She reached for her trauma shears, clipped to her scrubs where they had been clipped since the day she put on this temporary badge. The callsign engraved on the handle caught the fluorescent light. Angel 6. The callsign from her last combat rotation, 22 years ago, in a war that had ended but never stopped. "I need space," she said. The voice that came out wasn't a request. It was a command. The anesthesiologist stepped back. One of the nurses, maybe recognizing something in the way Rachel moved, or maybe just relieved that someone was finally doing something, pulled the crash cart closer. 47 seconds. That's what she had. That's what the oxygen deprivation timeline allowed. 47 seconds from incision to secured airway to the first breath that wouldn't be filtered through collapsed tissue. She palpated the cricothyroid membrane, that thin space between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage where the airway lived in its most accessible form. Her fingers found the landmark without hesitation. Muscle memory doesn't age. It doesn't forget. It doesn't care about temporary badges or orange access levels. Her hands knew what to do. They had done this in the dark. They had done this under fire. They had done this when the patient was a boy and the choice was operation or death. The scalpel moved. One smooth motion. The blade opened the airway in a line so clean it could have been measured. She inserted the trach tube, size 4.0 from the crash cart, her fingers working with the kind of precision that makes observers hold their breath. She secured it. Sutured it in place with movements that contained no hesitation, no doubt, no awareness that she was violating every access restriction, every scope of practice protocol, every institutional safeguard that Dr. Thornton had built to prevent exactly this. Then she connected the ambu bag and began to breathe for him. The monitors responded like a siren suddenly silenced. The oxygen saturation climbed. 40%. 50%. 60%. The rhythm returned. The electrical chaos moved into something almost musical. The patient's eyes fluttered open, and in that fraction of a second where consciousness returned to a body that was about to leave forever, his gaze found hers. Recognition flashed across his face like a switch being thrown. His hand, weak and trembling from the medication still in his bloodstream, moved in a sign that only someone who had known him before he was broken could possibly understand. His fingers moved in the shape that meant gratitude. That meant memory. That meant angel. Rachel's jaw clenched. She remembered the Humvee. The fire. The way his small hands had gripped her uniform and she had whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She remembered lying. She remembered the weight of him as she carried him toward the dust-off, toward the medevac, toward a life that would happen somewhere other than Korengal Valley, in a country he didn't know, in a silence that was either mercy or curse, and she had never been sure which. Behind her, outside the doorway, Dr. Thornton was already on his phone. She could hear him even through the alarm and the ventilator sounds and the monitors recalibrating to a stable rhythm. Yes, I need a full incident report. Yes, she performed an unauthorized emergency procedure. Yes, I'm building the termination file right now. Scope of practice violation, patient endangerment, breach of access restrictions, I have 17 documented infractions. She won't be here by end of shift. Rachel didn't turn around. She kept her hands on the ambu bag. She kept the airway open. She kept the deaf veteran breathing, and she didn't flinch, didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the man who was already erasing her from Valley Memorial with the same institutional precision that had nearly let this patient die. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum under their plastic diffusers. The airway was collapsing. Rachel saw it in the O2 SAT, 68 and falling, and watched 20 doctors stand frozen behind their protocols like monuments to fear. The crash cart had arrived. The monitors screamed. And nobody moved. She didn't ask permission. She shoved through the crowd, her trauma shears already in her hand, the steel catching fluorescent light as she moved. The blade was sharp. The angle was muscle memory. The cricothyroid membrane lay between the thyroid and cricoid cartilage, and her hands had found this space so many times in the dark that the hospital lights felt like overexposure. 47 seconds. That was all the math that mattered now. The needle went in. Angled 30 degrees downward. The hiss of air escaping. O2 sat climbing, 72, 76, 82. Her left hand anchored his jaw while her right secured the tube with tape torn between her teeth. No assistant. No asking. No waiting for someone else to carry the responsibility. She breathed for him manually, her own lungs pushing oxygen into the airway she'd carved open, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from holding dying soldiers in her arms while helicopters screamed overhead and fire painted the sky. The veteran's eyes opened. Conscious. Terrified. Then focused. He looked at her and his hands moved, signing something in the space between them, some question in American Sign Language that she couldn't read but understood anyway. You saved me. Again, his hand said. His blood was on her scrubs now. On her trauma shears. On the blade that had her call sign engraved into the handle, Angel 6, though nobody in this hospital could read what it meant. She kept her hand steady, kept breathing for him, kept the airway patent while the monitors sang their mechanical hymn. Vitals normalizing. BP climbing. Heart rate dropping from the 160s back into territory where humans lived instead of barely survived. The room exploded into motion around her. Orders shouted. New staff arriving. Someone pushing a portable ventilator. But Rachel didn't move her hands. She stayed exactly where she was because that's what trauma surgery meant. The person holding the airway doesn't leave until someone equally skilled can take over. That was the covenant. That was the rule that mattered. It took another 4 minutes before the respiratory therapist secured the tube properly and Rachel could step back. She set her trauma shears on the table beside the monitor. Wiped the blood carefully with a piece of gauze. Clipped them back to her scrubs where they'd been for 3 days, engraved call sign facing inward, hidden, just part of the uniform of a temporary nurse who appeared to be nobody at all. Dr. Thornton stood in the doorway. His face had turned the color of old parchment. 12 minutes later, a security escort walked into the room. Not the friendliest kind. Not the kind that asked questions. Just the kind that stated facts in voices like metal filing cabinets. Your badge has been deactivated. You need to leave the floor immediately. Rachel didn't argue. She'd known this was coming the moment her hands moved without permission. She gathered her things from the break room locker, a framed photograph of a man in dress uniform, his name embossed in gold at the base, his smile frozen in time at 28 years old, and carried the box down the corridor. The escort stayed 3 paces behind her, professional and impassive, which somehow made it worse than anger would have been. The next morning, Rachel showed up for her shift at 6:36 a.m. Her badge wouldn't scan at the employee entrance. The magnetic strip had been deactivated overnight. She took the stairs to security instead, where a woman at the desk looked up from her computer with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd seen this before. "Torres, right? He's waiting." He was waiting. Dr. Thornton stood near the desk with a manila folder that looked 2 inches thick. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up a pair of scissors, the kind with curved blades used for cutting sterile packaging. He placed Rachel's hospital ID on the desk and cut it in half. The sound it made was loud enough that everyone in the lobby heard it. "Scope of practice violation," he said, and he was reading from his folder now, each accusation printed and formatted and documented with the kind of institutional weight that turned actions into crimes. "Unauthorized invasive procedure. Patient endangerment. 16 documented infractions. Your termination is effective immediately." The papers were all correct. Every single one. She'd been on a non-critical floor without authorization. She'd performed a procedure outside her civilian scope. She'd made a decision that, by the letter of hospital protocol, was absolutely and technically wrong. The fact that the patient would have died without it didn't appear in the folders. Facts like that got translated into liability instead of heroism. 2 security guards appeared, silent as shadows. One carried a cardboard box with her other belongings. They walked her through the lobby at 8:15 a.m., past 40 nurses and orderlies and patients, past the gift shop and the main information desk where someone whispered, "That's the Band-Aid girl," and past the wall of windows that looked out onto Philadelphia's morning traffic. The rain started as she drove to the cemetery. It came down hard enough to make the road sheen with standing water, hard enough that she had to ease off the accelerator on Route 76, hard enough that the windshield wipers couldn't quite keep up. The grass at Holy Cross was soaked and cold. Her shoes left prints in the mud as she walked to the grave marker, not a cross, but a simple stone with a name and 2 dates and nothing else, because words seemed insufficient for the distance between 1992 and 2018. Captain Marcus Torres, killed in action. Rachel knelt in the mud. The rain hammered down like some kind of judgment, and she touched his name where it was carved into granite, her fingers tracing the letters he'd never lived to see engraved. Her composure had been armor for 3 days. Her composure had held through the humiliation and the sabotage and the moment she'd been escorted out of Valley Memorial like a criminal. But armor has limits. "I saved his life twice," she whispered to the stone, to the man buried underneath it, to the 26 years of marriage that had ended in a phone call from the army notifying her that her husband had been killed by an IED in a place nobody in Congress could pronounce. "I saved him and they called me reckless. I did the only thing that mattered and they're calling it criminal." Her hand shook. Not from cold. The trembling came from something deeper, not fear but the exhaustion of restraint finally breaking. She'd held everything together so precisely for so long that the unraveling felt like the only truth left. The rain mixed with tears she didn't intend to cry, and she pressed her forehead against the stone. "Maybe I should have stayed buried with you," she said. "Maybe that would have been cleaner. Maybe that would have meant something." The wind came up, pushing rain sideways across the cemetery, and Rachel Torres knelt there in the mud with her hospital badge cut in half and her career disassembled into 16 documented infractions. The trauma shears were still clipped to her jacket, hidden under a rain-soaked windbreaker. The call sign on the blade was too small for the rain to wash away, even if it tried. Below the hospital, in ICU Room 4, the deaf veteran breathed through an emergency airway that had been created by hands that had no right, according to protocol, to save his life. But that was the thing about protocols, they were written by people who'd never stood in a burning building, never held a child's hand while a city burned, never learned that sometimes the only law that mattered was the one written in muscle memory and mercy. Dr. Thornton was already drafting the paperwork that would prevent Rachel Torres from ever working in hospital administration again. He had no idea, standing in his office at Valley Memorial with his fountain pen and his carefully organized termination packets, that he was about to have a very different kind of conversation with people who didn't care about his protocols at all. But that conversation would have to wait for morning light and helicopter rotors and the kind of authority that didn't require scissors or folders to make itself known. Tonight, Rachel Torres knelt at her dead husband's grave and let the armor fall away. The next afternoon at 2:35 p.m., every screen in Valley Memorial's lobby cut to breaking news. Not a small crawl at the bottom. A full takeover. The kind of interruption that stops conversations mid-sentence. Rachel Torres. Brigadier General. Decorated combat veteran. Missing for 36 hours after exposing a medical kidnapping ring operating out of their own basement. The sedated patient she'd seen at 2 a.m. wasn't a routine surgery. He was a smuggled witness. A federal informant. Dr. Thornton had been moving him to a private facility, off the books, for a criminal organization paying 6 figures a month. The news anchor's voice carried the weight of a scandal that was still unfolding. Hospital staff are being questioned by the FBI. The 20 doctors who refused to intervene during a patient emergency are now facing federal subpoenas for obstruction of justice. And the temporary nurse they fired is a decorated general whose surgical intervention saved a U.S. citizen's life. The hospital board convened in emergency session at 3:53 p.m., same conference room where they'd planned Rachel's termination. But the chairs were rearranged now. Federal agents stood against the back wall. News vans crowded the parking lot. The deaf veteran sat at the board table with an ASL interpreter beside him, his posture straight, his eyes harder than steel. When the board chairman asked him to recount what happened, he didn't speak. He signed. His hands moved like weapons. Like testimony carved into the air itself. The interpreter's voice trembled as she spoke his words. She saved me in Korengal Valley when I was 11 years old. A local boy. American crossfire turned everything to fire and screaming. She pulled me from a burning Humvee. Held my throat closed with her bare hands for 30 minutes until evac arrived. I lost my hearing. Lost my family. But I lived because of her. She gave me breath when I had none. And when I was dying in that hallway, she saved me again. While 20 of your doctors debated liability. While your administrator filed paperwork. She gave me breath. He stopped signing. The silence in that room was the kind that breaks careers. The board members exchanged glances that said everything. They'd made a catastrophic error. But it was about to get worse. The FBI agent stepped forward with a folder, thick, documented, damning, and read from Rachel's actual file. Not the one Dr. Thornton had constructed. Her real file. Bronze Star. The clerk's voice cracked over the words. Silver Star. Another pause. The weight of it settling into the room like a stone. 2 purple hearts. The board chairman's face had gone the color of old paper. Distinguished Service Cross. And then the SEAL team leader in dress blues, the one who'd been waiting by the doors, stepped into the center of the room. His presence alone made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer, as if the room was dimming itself out of respect. He opened a second file. Classified decorations. Commendations that couldn't be read aloud in a public hospital conference room. Names of operations. Dates. Numbers of lives saved. The board was hearing information that probably violated 3 separate security clearances just being spoken inside 4 walls. The SEAL commander's voice was quiet as a blade. General Torres has every right to take this hospital apart, legally. She's chosen not to. I'd suggest you don't make her reconsider. Dr. Thornton stood. His lawyer had arrived an hour ago, a sharp woman in a grey suit who'd immediately advised him to stay silent, but rage or panic or some combination of the two had override her counsel. He opened his mouth. The security guard, the same one who'd escorted Rachel out of the building the day before, stepped forward and placed a cardboard box on his desk. Methodically. Deliberately. Like a judge striking a gavel. Not a word was said. The message was absolute. The guard's voice, when he finally spoke, was the kind of calm that precedes catastrophe. I believe you know the way out, sir. Thornton's lawyer touched his arm. They walked past the FBI agent. They walked past the SEAL commander. They walked past the deaf veteran, who watched them go with eyes that had survived worse than administrative termination. By 4:15 p.m., Dr. Thornton's hospital credentials were revoked pending investigation. By 5:44 p.m., his name was trending on social media with the hashtag #DeathByForms. By 6:24 p.m., his malpractice insurance company had begun preliminary termination procedures. By midnight, his wife had moved into her sister's place in King of Prussia with their 2 daughters. 19 days later, he was offered a position at a strip mall urgent care clinic off Route 1, between a tax preparation service and a cell phone store. No benefits. No prestige. No power. The salary was 30% of what he'd made at Valley Memorial. He took it because it was the only offer that came. 6 months later, Rachel walked the corridors of Valley Memorial in dark blue scrubs with her name embroidered across the pocket, Brig. Gen. Rachel Torres, MD, Trauma Director. The orange temp badge was gone. In its place, platinum-level access that opened every door. Staff nodded as she passed. Not the quick nods they'd given the temporary nurse. These were the nods of deference. Of respect earned through blood and protocol broken and lives saved when the system chose to let them die. Her office occupied the corner of the 3rd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, 2 monitors, a desk carved from dark walnut. On that desk, in a glass display case with brass nameplates, sat her trauma shears. The call sign engraved along the handle gleamed under the office light, Angel 6. Beside the case, a framed photograph of a man in marine dress blues, his eyes carrying the same steel as hers, his jaw set at the same angle. Captain Marcus Torres. Below the photo, a brass plaque read, "Both warriors. Both home." The rain hammered the windows, not the rain from the cemetery parking lot 6 months ago, but the same kind of rain, the same rhythm, reminding her that some things never change. Grief doesn't soften. It just teaches you how to carry it. At 7:44 a.m. on a Tuesday, Rachel conducted morning rounds with 7 surgical residents, and the way she moved through the ICU was the way apex predators move through territory, purposeful, calm, utterly in command. She stopped at a patient's bedside and began teaching. Not lecturing. Teaching. The protocol exists to guide you, not paralyze you. When 20 people cite regulations while 1 person is dying, you have a systems failure, not a liability problem. Your job is to fix the failure, not participate in it. A resident's hand shot up. But what if the attending won't authorize the procedure? Rachel's eyes met his like a laser sight meeting a target. Then you document that you asked. And then you do your job. You save the life. You file the report. And you accept the consequences of choosing to be a doctor instead of a bureaucrat. The residents wrote furiously. One of them, a young woman, maybe 28, sharp as a scalpel, watched Rachel with the intensity of someone watching a master class on how to be dangerous without ever raising your voice. After rounds, that resident cornered her in the hallway. How did you know they wouldn't fire you for that? For breaking protocol. Rachel didn't stop walking. I didn't know. I went anyway. That's the job. The resident swallowed hard. Even if they had fired you. Rachel's voice was quiet as the blade of a surgeon's knife, especially then. The deaf veteran, Zahir Ahmadi, though that wasn't his birth name, though he'd been 11 years old when Rachel pulled him from fire and held his throat closed, now worked as a hospital translator. He moved through Valley Memorial with the same quiet authority Rachel carried, fluent in English, ASL, Pashto, and 3 dialects of Dari. He was teaching Rachel ASL in the hospital cafeteria during lunch, his hands moving through signs she'd only begun to understand in the aftermath of everything. She watched his hands. She listened to the language of motion and precision. When he signed her name, 2 fingers downward from her chest, a gesture of respect and recognition, it carried the weight of 20 years and 2 separate rescues and a promise made to a terrified boy in Korengal Valley that somehow, against all odds, she had kept. In the supply closet where Dr. Thornton had cornered her 6 months ago, Rachel now restocked emergency kits with a new temporary nurse. The girl, couldn't have been more than 23, nervous, fragile, watched Rachel work with the intensity of someone studying a document they needed to remember. Rachel handed her a trauma kit. If you see something wrong, speak up. If no one listens, act anyway. That's the job. The temp nurse's voice came out small, scared, even if they fire you. Rachel didn't look up from the gauze she was organizing. Her voice carried the kind of certainty that comes from having already survived the worst, especially then. At sunset, Rachel drove to the cemetery in Laurel Hill. Not the rain-soaked parking lot visit from half a year ago. Clean light now. Golden light. The kind that makes everything look like it might, somehow, be okay. She knelt at the grave of Captain Marcus Torres, and for a moment, just a moment, she let the armor shift. Not fall. Shift. She placed a single flower on the stone. A violet. His favorite. I kept the promise, she whispered to the granite and the earth and the man whose voice she could still hear in the silence. I saved him. Both times. She stood. Her trauma shears caught the last light as she clipped them to her belt, habit now, the same way Marcus had carried his sidearm, the same way she'd carried everything that mattered. When she turned from the grave, Zahir was waiting by her car, leaning against the driver's side door with the patience of someone who understands that grief is a country with its own language and its own borders. He didn't speak. He didn't sign. He just waited. Rachel walked toward him, and when she reached the car, he smiled, the first time she'd seen him truly smile since she'd known him, and opened the passenger door for her. The hospital shift began at 8:48 p.m. The trauma bay was quiet, the way it always was before the chaos. Rachel and Zahir walked through the double doors together, the fluorescent lights humming their metallic song, the smell of antiseptic and preparation settling into her lungs the way breath settles into rescued lungs. Everything was ready. Everything was waiting. The city beyond the windows was still turning. The ambulances were still racing through the streets. The world was still breaking people in ways that protocol couldn't fix, and that was precisely why she was here. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to remember what you're fighting for. If you found this story as powerful as we did, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and comment below, what would you do if you were standing in Rachel's shoes? When would you break protocol? And more importantly, who would stand beside you when the system tried to destroy you for doing the right thing? Thank you for watching.